A few years back in 2016, IACD for the first time agreed as a membership a national statement on community development, which is what we call the definition. It's a sort of statement, if you like. It's our position statement. I was the president at the time, and that was the result of a lot of consultation, and we launched that at the Minnesota conference in 2016. And after that, we were also at the same time, doing some research into how many graduate and undergraduate courses there were in community development around the world. And that work was led by the then Vice President, Randy Adams. And we came up with about 1,000, I think, different programs around the world. But we also discovered by doing that, this is programs which had community development in the title of the degree, but it could have been community development and health, or rural and community development studies, or community economic development. It could be a whole range. And what we discovered by looking at some of the modules and some of the content was we weren't convinced that everybody had the same understanding of what community development meant. I mean, obviously, these are two English words, community and development, and what they look like in translation, in many different countries around the world. So we thought, building upon the experience of a number of countries in producing national standards for community development, that we might have a go at producing some international standards or some sort of guidelines. Now, I'll just say what standards are very briefly. It goes back really to about the 1990s or so in the field in some countries around the world, that quite a few employers, governmental and NGO employers, weren't entirely happy with the graduates who said they had community development qualifications when they were applying for their jobs. Could they actually do the job? And I think there was some feeling that they could talk the talk. There was a lot of good community development theory, but did they know how to do it? What did the job involve? And did they actually have the skills, not just the knowledge, and also the sort of ethical commitment to actually do the job? So this is called it was called the Competencies Movement, and it was quite widespread around the world, but it was very much picked up in the British Isles, in the UK and in Ireland to start with, and then we've seen it being picked up in many other countries. And really, it asks the question, what's the function of the community development practitioner? And from that, you say, well, what is it they do? What is it they need to be skilled about, knowledgeable about, and the approach that they take? And from that, you do a functional analysis, and then you identify the main competencies or cluster of competencies that you require, irrespective of your specialism, health, economic development, cultural work, or whatever, to be a development practitioner, and wherever you are in the world, in a rural or urban context. And we tried to explore this, building upon some of the national standards that we knew existed. And so in 2018, again, as the result of widespread consultation with IACD members and others, we published a report called Towards International Standards in Community Development Practice. And they're very, very basic standards. They're sort of themes. So it is, how do you engage with the community? How do you ensure inclusivity? How do you ensure participative planning? How do you ensure participative evaluation? How do you organize the community? How do you work in an educative way within the community? How can you encourage empowering leadership? How do you exit from that community? These sorts of they may seem very, very basic questions, but they're actually very clear ones. And frankly, unless if practitioners can't do these sorts of things, then really they're not able to practice their craft. And we obviously, as a professional association, want to ensure that practitioners around the world who say they're doing community development are really doing it in a competent way in the service of the communities that they're working with. So this report came out in 2018, and as members of IACD will know, it's the most widely translated report, and I believe disseminated report that IACD has ever produced. I chaired that working group, and there were a number of people involved in it. And again, we did wide consultation with the field and members on that. Now, around about the same time, we discussed within IACD, well, why don't we produce materials that can help follow those standards? And we'd had floating around on the Training and Publications Committee for a while the idea that IACD might collaborate with Routledge on the publishers, Routledge, on producing a book. And for those who've been involved in community development for a long time, or those new to community development, students hoping to enter the field, Routledge are the leading publisher around the world of community development books. And they have been widely known since the 1970s in this field. And so we put forward a proposal to Routledge, and the editorial board there said they were very keen and they'd like us to go ahead with it. So that's why we started the idea. So if you like, the germ of the idea was to follow up the standards with some practical, useful case study material, and also to go in maybe greater depth than the standards report had been able to do, which is only, what, I think it's about 10 pages, the standards report. This book is nearly 300 pages. So it's really illuminating what the standards were all about, where the standards came from, and the journey that we've been on as a field over the last 5 or 6 decades in really saying to employers and the United Nations and NGOs and the EU and other bodies, local authorities, etc., this is what we're about, and this is how we do it.
Nice. Oh, that's perfect. That tells the story from start to finish.
Okay.
That's really good.
Okay, do you want me to just say a little bit more about the content of the book?
Yeah, a little bit more about the content and just any kind of ideas or anything that you think we're doing differently that nobody else is really doing.
Okay. So the book is based around the 8 themes in the international standards, the ones I mentioned before: how to organize, how to work in an educative way, how to do participative planning, etc., etc. So they make up 8 chapters of the 10 chapters of the book. The first chapter, however, introduces the reader to why we've been on this journey and how those skill sets and areas of knowledge, including the values and ethics involved in our field, how they've emerged. And we take us back in that first chapter really to the United Nations in the 1950s, encouraging member states to promote at a community level the social and economic development of poorer communities around the world. Now, originally that was seen in a sort of post-colonial period with 100 new states emerging after the collapse of the European empires, but also with the USA withdrawing from the Philippines, etc. But also what we see on that journey is this wasn't just a Western sort of post-colonial sort of development method. You also saw within the communist countries, in People's Republic of China, Cuba in particular, and indeed in countries of the USSR, that they were part of that journey as well. There was a tendency perhaps to have a more of a top-down approach in some of those countries, but not entirely, particularly in the community health field, for example. China was way ahead of many Western countries, and places like Kazakhstan had a fantastic international conference that really embedded the whole idea of community development approaches to health. Cuba was doing, and other parts of Latin America were doing inspiring work about community education and adult education approaches to literacy development, that sort of field. So you see what we try and show there, and also in the non-aligned countries, the ones that are not part of the West, weren't necessarily part of the East in that old Cold War terminology, countries particularly like India, which is the main leader of the non-aligned bloc, also doing some absolutely incredible work in the community development field in the 50s, 60s and beyond. And you see indigenous community development ideas like the Ajama movement emerging in Africa. So what we wanted to get over on that journey is that community development wasn't an Anglo-American approach to development imposed on different countries, although a lot of the English-speaking world signed up to this in the US and the Commonwealth countries, Canada, Australia, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, etc., South Africa. That it was emerging all over the place, that basically the UN was encouraging support at a local level in social and economic development. And then later, what we see is an interest in environmental work and sustainable development starting to emerge later on this journey. And as practitioners and researchers and others were doing this work and reflecting on it, they were starting to distill, well, what is it, what approaches are we taking? And what are we, and maybe what are the good approaches that work and what are the ones that don't work? In the 50s and the early 60s, it's largely in more rural communities, but you see the US government and others in Europe, Britain, for example, starting to apply community development approaches in an urban context in the background of the civil rights movement, the regeneration and redevelopment of cities, mass transportation, replanning as motorways are tearing through cities, slum clearance programs, and you're getting communities saying, hold on a minute, we want to be consulted on this. We want to be engaged in this process. So this, by the 1970s, community development is very much an urban as well as a rural practice. And what we also see until really the end of the 70s is that it is governments that are largely taking the lead on this, encouraged by the UN, either federal or state governments, or at a local level, particularly local authorities. And you'll often find that development practitioners are being employed by local authorities. But of course, during that journey, there are other players, the charity sector, the non-governmental sector, foundations, and even a little bit the private sector, particularly concerned around community economic development and trying to help communities be more entrepreneurial, if you like. So we see that journey all again, we're learning from this journey, and through organizations like IACD, that's been around a long time, but also national professional associations, from conference, from scholarship, from research into the practice, we begin, as I say, to come up with what we still think is the basic sort of skill set that development practitioners, irrespective of their other specialist disciplines they may have. What we also see on that journey is that no single discipline actually originated community development methods. It didn't come out of community work. It didn't come out of cultural work. It didn't come out of social work. It did come out of them, but it came out of many other areas. So we've been eclectic. We've drawn on what health practitioners have done, working at a community level in poor and disadvantaged and vulnerable communities, social work practitioners, environmental practitioners, artists, I mean, all sorts, adult educators, whatever, all sorts of disciplines have contributed towards community development and have helped us understand what the academics call the praxis, practice and theory combined of community development is all about, and continues. It's an evolving process. So what we emerged during that period was a sort of hybrid professional field of, at one level you're a development practitioner, but on another level you're maybe a health worker or a social worker. So the practitioners of community development often hold more than one discipline, if you like. What we all share in common, and what you find at IACD conferences, is people from a whole range of backgrounds and disciplines and employers and different scales of agencies, big local authorities or small community-based development agencies, coming to our conferences. It's not just social workers that come to IACD conferences, it is people from a whole range of backgrounds. And I believe, and I think the book shows this is the real richness of our field, that it's been very eclectic, but what has emerged is a commonality of practice, or at least, as I say, a sharing and an exchange, and a growing understanding of what works or what doesn't work. and the sorts of principles that we would want to apply and the approaches that we would recommend practitioners and agencies adopt. So we go on that journey over 5 decades and see this emerging professional field. So it is not true to say that, you know, we knew exactly what community development was in 1960. We didn't. It is quite different now. Some of the ideas are there in the early days, but we've learnt much more. And we go right up really to the Sustainable Development Goals published by the United Nations in 2016, it was. And briefly, we also comment on what's happened since then. You know, the rise of the neo-rights, Trump, Bolsonaro, those sorts of governments, but also now maybe we're back on track to more of that sort of agreed development agenda to deal with some of the main crises that are around over the next decade, such as climate change, the inequalities agenda. And we pick up from that in the final chapter 10, where, so chapter 1 is taking everybody on this journey and showing how rich we are as a field, because we've drawn on many, many disciplines, and these disciplines have shared their ideas as to what works and what doesn't work. Then looking at the 8 different competency themes. And then in the final chapter, we're sort of looking forward and saying, what are the priorities we feel for development agencies and for practitioners in the decade to come? So that's the journey that we've been on, and that's what the book is trying to illuminate. And we're doing this by way of introductory essays in each chapter, written by teams of sort of 2 or 3 IACD members. They could be practitioners, they could be scholars, researchers, agency managers, or whatever, but we get cluster these, and we've consciously tried to get them from different parts of the country, of the world. So you don't have a chapter just written by Brits or Americans or Indians or whatever. We try to mix those. And we tried also to mix people from different backgrounds. So they may have focused on environmental work, or they may just have focused on health. We tried to force them into teams, if you like. And then after each essay, we have 5 case studies from around the world. So in all, there are 40 case studies written by about 60 people, from Mongolia to Ecuador, from South Africa to the United States, from Canada to Australia, from India to Peru. I mean, really loads. And that, I think, is a real richness, because what we've asked those authors to do is to look at that particular competency area. For example, how we engaged with the community. And we've asked them to say, well, how did you do it? And how did that help shape the subsequent development program that you were doing? Or the other one might be, how did you work with the community to evaluate the program to see how well it was going, how you needed to change things, how you needed to write up reports in order to submit to funders to get continuing funding, that sort of thing. So this is the journey, and all in all, with the essay writers and the 3 lead editors, myself, Anna Clarke, and Daniel Muia, the 3 of us, that's about 70 of us have contributed to the book. And I think that's the real, I hope, the real richness in it. So justify, maybe the other thing, we also said to everybody, don't write in an academic way. So it is an academic book, it is a peer review, it will be a peer-reviewed book, etc., etc. But we said, write in the first person or the third person. You know, I did this, you might consider that. Just sort of try and write in a plain language way. And one of the reasons, but both, I think this is vitally important for students and lecturers and communities that we work with to be able to understand what it is we're saying and writing about ourselves. But also, and I think, okay, this is a personal reflection after nearly 50 years involvement in community development, that I think many of the academic writing in our field is quite mystifying, is not well written, and is full of jargon, and full of a language level that I think a lot of communities that we'd be working with, and I don't make this in any sort of patronizing way or whatever, it's just not written in plain language. So we wanted this book to, what I hope, be an exemplar and a sort of a call to arms to everybody in our field to write more simply, write more plainly, write in a language people can understand and engage with. So we hope, therefore, the book will be used, dipped into, read through it from beginning to end if you want, but you don't have to. You can just focus in on a particular chapter. And that along with the standards, it will help you, as, for example, as a community development trainer or educator, on how to design your courses, your degrees or certificates or whatever, what the modules might look like, and some of the course material that could be in there, including various referenced material that each of the chapter contributors provide. And also, as I say, for agency managers and practitioners and students, just to sort of reflect upon and see, well, how does my practice relate to this? How does our agency's practice relate to this?